Morning or afternoon, everybody. Morning. Somebody was asking me, why did you put the word real? That's because there's another green revolution in Ethiopia. I think they've just planted 5 million trees to try and fight back the Sahara, and so everybody says that's the green revolution. But I'm like, no, you're missing the real green revolution. But are we all ready for it? So I'm a pediatrician by training. I'm an entrepreneur. I have worked in 13 African countries. Currently from Uganda, and I'm assisting the government there to make regulations on licensing of medical cannabis. And with probably by the end of this year or very early next year, we will have very robust regulations. But I want to just discuss from an African point of view what we think medical cannabis should be best, how medical cannabis should be best done, so that we can all have an advantage. I really like the previous speaker who said we shouldn't leave the local folks behind. So, but are we as ourselves ready for the real revolution? We're famous for quotes. Africa is famous for quotes. So I'm going to just start with a quote which says, growing marijuana, even medical marijuana, is satanic. I wonder who said that, right? Many people would think that it was probably the colonialists who came before and just demonized it. Actually, those are 4 kings in my country, with some of the first colonialists who just arrived, but actually it wasn't them who said it. When they did come, this was the first operation done in Uganda by somebody called Dr. Albert Cook, and he actually was a very well-known advocate for medical marijuana. So the person who actually said that quote was the first lady of my country, and that's her. During an evangelical meeting, that's her daughter there, she's a pastor, and they were demonizing medical marijuana. And that's the dichotomy we have on the continent. We have people who absolutely hate the mention of the word, and then there are people just like the previous speaker said, we have a culture of medical marijuana on the continent. And the reason why it's demonized in East Africa, that's where Uganda is for those who are asking, really is because the religion part is very strong. So this is just a Pew study which just shows that 82% of our people actually believes very, very strongly in moral issues. And so they look at medical marijuana as something very immoral. And this is just not to Uganda, but it's mostly most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. However, that other picture there is just a museum down the road from where I stay. You can actually see that medical marijuana has a very rich history in our continent. It was first recognized in Egyptian mummies almost 5,000 BC, but it officially came through Asia around the 1500s, and it has actually permeated itself through the culture. So you can see that there are some hunters. These are in the Serengeti, just on the lower left. Before they go hunting, they smoke some cannabis, and also some of the medicinal plants include a lot of cannabis plants as well for traditional medicine. Our tribes are well known for worshipping cannabis. The well-known one are the Bashilange, where they have a tribe called they have a cult called the Binariamba, and Binariamba basically means the sons of cannabis. And Senusi also well known in Libya, as well as the Luo in Uganda, where it was forbidden to actually smoke cannabis before you went to war. So with all that history, you can also see that some of the medicinal properties were actually well known, not 100% robust science, but at least traditionally they were used to treat certain diseases around the continent. For example, sore eyes, that's particularly in Egypt, in the ancient Egypt specifically. As we all know, just like everywhere else in the world, cannabis was deemed satanic, and you can see in the continent, around the 1912s, just before 1925, most of the cannabis was actually banned. And this is a recent footage or photography from Uganda. Every now and then you'll have some article where the government goes and just raises down cannabis plants because either they want to have a lot of mileage with the population, or they think that it's a very bad thing. However, there's a lot of renewed interest, particularly from the government, in this particular, in medical cannabis. As most of the people have mentioned here, with the FDA approval of many drugs, there's a lot of interest. But more importantly, there's recognition that the cannabis industry can actually provide jobs. And as you can see in this Pew Research setup, the most important problem for people in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of jobs. And so there's an opening where some of these industries can actually provide jobs for many of the local communities. And why? As you can see, Africa is in a very good zone for growing medical cannabis. It's usually either side of the equator, 35 degrees because of the sunlight. And also there's a lot of other factors, but one of the biggest hindrances might also be legislation, and we should just talk about that. But basically, countries are trying to encourage investors to come and and grow marijuana and medical cannabis, specifically by making sure that there is limited red tape and that there is as little political interference as possible. We still have issues with infrastructure. Some of you guys know there's a lot of Chinese money on the continent, specifically with the Road and Belt Initiative. So we are seeing a lot of highways to nowhere. And so sometimes some of these highways can actually be used to build infrastructure to where we can actually grow and produce manufacturing centers as well. There's a lot of investor incentives that are on the continent in some of these governments. For example, in Uganda, where I'm at, in Kenya and in Rwanda, you can actually get free land, and I'm not saying that you should buy some of this land, or at least lease it, but there's a lot of investor incentive specifically for exporters. And of course, the labor force, many of these countries, particularly Uganda, has a highly literate English-speaking labor force, and Uganda is also quite close. It's very close to Europe compared to most of the Southern African countries as well. We probably know this slide, or at least how medical marijuana is evolving on the continent. We know that, for example, Lesotho and Zimbabwe have really gone quite far in licensing medical marijuana for export. South Africa, Uganda are kind of like the next batch of people, or the next sweet spot. And then Malawi and Ghana are moving at a fast rate towards licensing it as well. The rest of Africa still has a long way to go, but there's a lot of conversation that is going through to ensure that there's licensure. But it's not just as easy as that. Some of these countries, even though they might be licensing, might not have specific regulations. So for example, in Uganda, we do have already people who are exporting it because there are no objection letters that they acquired. But currently, as I said, we are trying to finalize regulations, to ensure that there is a good standard that also includes the local investors as well. So across the continent, and particularly in East Africa as well, the types of licenses that are on offer, or at least that are being talked about, are the operator licenses, the cultivation, testing, transport, non-academic research, supply and distribution, and also manufacturing. Specifically in Uganda, in 2016, we updated our legal, the legislation to permit the Minister of Health to provide written consent for cultivation, and this wasn't there previously, and also to have our national drug authorities, be like the FDA, to provide licenses for cultivation. And currently, as I said, as we stand, we're in the final phases of providing regulation. finalizing regulations so that we can have licensed export, preferably of value-added export. I think our president, we shall see later, is very, very key on how do we bring value add, how do we have added value to our exports. So we're not just exporting only raw materials, or at least So how do we get some of these countries to change their policies? Because even though Uganda, Malawi, and Lesotho and Zimbabwe, as you can see, are on that path, how do we get them to actually change their policies? One, engaging. Engaging is very key. There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be brought on board, particularly the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Finances. So the government is very key, as well as drug enforcers, because a lot of the regulation surrounds them. An important constituent is also the legislators. In Kenya, for example, recently one of the members of parliament developed end-stage cancer. And just before he died, I think he died like 3 months ago, but just before he died, he was very passionate in opening up the legal space for cannabis. So engaging legislators as well. And as you'll see later, some of the members of parliament, for example, in Malawi and Uganda, are also becoming very, very vocal. Communities is very important, as we see that there's a lot of initial or a knee-jerk reaction when you mention the word cannabis in many circles, and these are very influential people. So engaging them and also engaging communities in CSRs. So right now, most of the industry that is being involved, that we're being asked to do some form of CSR to make sure that you're empowering the community. So whatever you do, you must have a very strong CSR component. Authenticate. We've been talking about lack of proper evidence of the use of the efficacy of medical marijuana. So there's need to make sure that we have a lot of medical research specifically. I know the Minister of Health, she's a fellow pediatrician and a classmate of mine. She talks a lot about us getting a lot of evidence so that we can actually back up and have a good firm background on opening up the sector. Economic benefits. The economic benefits specifically as well for the communities, because right now we're talking mostly about the medical benefits, but how does us engaging in this trade help the society? That's a very strong driver amongst many of the politicians and many of the decision makers in these countries as well. And also, of course, most of the decision makers tend to be politicians, so you need to show them exactly how this is politically beneficial to them. Then organize. Organizing is a very important thing, because right now everybody is either racing as if it's the gold rush, and so we're all fractured. But I think a very important thing to do is to all organize and speak with a concerted voice. Instead of fighting each other, we should be able to push together. So there are very many different organizations and very many different consortia that are pushing for the legalization of medical cannabis, at least to start with. And I'll show you one of the consortia that I'm in, where we're trying to push for medical evidence, and then eventually opening up the medical cannabis space as well. Also, even the cultivators and even the manufacturers should be able to put themselves and be able to speak into one voice, so they become more and more visible. So, what's the crystal ball? First of all, as you probably know, licenses are being given up across the continent, but now governments are waking up and saying, there has to be a certain standard, or at least a barrier. Well, not a barrier per se, but you must have a certain level of investor that we're looking for. And so they want to ask, is granting this license really in the public interest? I know, for example, in Lesotho, they are saying that any more master growers must actually have at least 10 years of experience. Of course, this also locks out some of the local investors, so there's a lot of clash around there. Where exactly are you going to locate these manufacturing hubs? And also, is there enough and adequate infrastructure? One of the challenges that is being faced is that even though we have a lot of good cultivation factors, infrastructure still remains quite poor. So does the investor come in and build up the infrastructure in terms of roads, water, and electricity? Or do we have a private-public partnership where the government also works along those areas as well? And of course, there's always the risk of diversion to the illicit market. Pertinent issues. Everybody's watching the harbingers. So if Lesotho doesn't get it right, then we're not going to open ourselves. If Uganda doesn't get it right, then we're not going to open ourselves to medical licensure. So every other government is watching to see what the harbinger states are actually doing. Many countries on their statute books, actually, if you look at some of their laws, they do have laws that permit licensed manufacture and export of narcotics and psychoactive drugs. But many of these are not functional. There are claims, of course, particularly in the early countries that opened up, that many licenses were being given out because of connections rather than competence. And so there's a lot of talk about how do we minimize and make sure that the ground is level for everybody. The big thing is about locally owned versus foreign-owned firms. A lot of indigenous players are feeling left out. And so it's very important that as you come into these new countries or these countries that are coming up, you're able to answer that question. Are you just coming in and parachuting in as a foreign investor and then taking all the money away, or are you actually partnering with people locally, both in terms of community and in terms of the businesses themselves? So infrastructure, I've mentioned that as well, and licenses. So cost of licenses appear to be going up. As we all know, initially, for example, in Lesotho, the licenses used to be free, and then now they are going up as well, just to ensure exclusivity. Okay, so those are the pertinent issues. Right now, in Uganda, to help assist policy change, we have what we call a cannabis coalition with the Uganda Medical Association, of which I'm a part of, the executive director as well, the Uganda National Academy of Sciences, and as well the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda, where we're trying to provide and encourage and look for evidence to make sure that there is no, basically providing evidence-based for freeing up of the cannabis space. It also helps, of course, that there's a president, we have an election very soon, and the front runner happens to be known as the president of Ganja. He used to be a singer, and right now he's one of the advocates of freeing up marijuana for recreational use. So are we really ready? That's a map of Uganda for the Green Revolution. As I started, that famous quote, the First Lady called it satanic. That was in April 19, some months ago. But now, just recently, in August, the president was able to launch the first marijuana growing manufacturer in the country. So thank you very much for